Hey guys, welcome to PB Garage. I'm about to show you everything that can go wrong with the rear brakes on your Smart 451 and how to fix it too. So some of the issues you'll run into on these Smart 450s and 451s with the rear drum brakes can range from terrible noises coming from the back end of the car to locked wheels, particularly happen quite a bit, and leaking fluid. So leaking fluid, obviously pretty easy to spot if you've got the wheel and you're collecting a little bit of oil in the bottom of the wheel there that you notice, or you're getting drips on the driveway, stuff like that from this area. That wheel cylinder in there can start to leak. I've had it happen on a couple of these cars. Easy to replace, we'll get into that in a second. But everything else is gonna come from basically the shoes and the hardware that holds the shoes. So before you go ahead, obviously I've got the wheel off here. Before you go ahead and pull this drum off the car, you may want to make sure that you have spare shoes and hardware to go into this, because once this drum comes off, sometimes what happens, those rear brake shoes come with it and they can fall apart, and then you won't be able to get it back together unless you replace those parts. So if you're just trying to figure out what's wrong with the car before you start to work on it, you may want to make sure that you have those parts on hand, especially if the car hasn't been serviced in a long time or if you don't have the history of it being serviced. So before getting into this job, I've gone ahead and ordered myself a pair of new shoes, or a set I should say, which will cover both sides of the car, and I've got a kit that has all the hardware to replace as well. So I've got the car jacked up, I've got the wheel off. The next thing I need to do before I can take this drum off is remove the little set screw that holds the drum against the wheel hub here, and it's a T30 Torx. Now it's not a bad idea to keep a spare one of these screws just in case. Sometimes they get stripped out when you're trying to remove them. Now more likely than not, this drum is not going to come off very easily for you. You're going to have to hammer away at it on this lip to try and get it loose and be able to pull it off. I'm going to use my handy little air chisel here. It does a great job for it. I know there's probably some specialty pullers and tools that you can use for this too, but you know, it can be a bit of a pain. I like to use this tool. I have done it before with a hammer and chisel, but it takes a bit of time. There we go, that's our drum off. Now here's what the inside of the drum's gonna look like. It's gonna be full of brake dust if it hasn't been serviced very recently. Don't worry about that, we can clean all that up later. Now I'm gonna show you what ends up being the issue with these brakes like 98 times out of 100, okay? What happens is these brake shoes get corroded. You can see they're pretty rusty here. They haven't been replaced in quite a long time. And what happens is the rust gets in between the friction material here and the backing plate, so the steel part, and then I can tell, yeah, okay. And that's basically what happens inside your wheel there. Your friction material will just delaminate, and I've had them actually come apart, get broken, and then they get wedged in here between the drum and the backing plate, or they get wedged in here by the slave cylinder and locks the wheel up completely. Car's undrivable until you hammer that drum off and replace these brake shoes again. So just having a look here, I mean, you can see how all that rust has gotten in on that backing plate for the shoe there and makes for a bad time. I bet you this other one's gonna come right off too. Oh, it's a little bit better. Oh, but not that good. All right, there you go. So you can see very little spot just holding it on there. Everything else was just completely corroded. So there you have it. Unfortunately, pretty common issue with these, that friction material just coming apart inside the wheel there and messing things up. That's where a lot of those screeching and grinding noises from the back end of the car come from, as well as just these coming apart. So the other thing you can check, which sometimes you have failures with, is all this hardware in here that holds the shoes. But I haven't seen that happen very often on these. You know, more often than not, all the hardware is fine. I usually replace it when I'm doing the brakes anyways, just to be on the safe side. But like I say, 98% of the time, it's these shoes just coming apart like that. Now the slave cylinder on this car seems to be in okay shape. The boots look intact and I'm not losing any fluid, so I don't think I'm gonna have to replace any of these. If I did have to replace them, it's actually a fairly easy job. You just have to remove the brake shoes like I'm about to show you, and then you come around the back side here of the backing plate. And if we just have a look back here, you can see all I'd have to do is undo this one brake line here and then remove these two 10mm bolts, and that wheel cylinder, that slave cylinder, will pull right out through sort of the front side of that drum brake. You can pop the new one in, do your 2 bolts back up, connect your brake line, remove this dust cap and bleed the cylinder here to get any air out of the system, and away you go. But luckily we don't have to do that on this car, so we can jump back to replacing our brake shoes. All right, so as we have a look here, I've got a special tool to remove our retainer springs. Handy tool. I mean, there's a bunch of different styles and types. I really like this one. So we can remove our springs and remove our posts, and I'll just show you guys what that assembly looks like. So you just spin that top cup until the ridges on the post slip through the slots. Do that on the other side as well, and then both of our brake shoes are free. And then I'll pull out the bottom of the brake shoes from their little holder and remove that bottom spring. Now it is a good idea, before you guys start to take this all apart, I would take pictures of where all the springs are living, because there are several holes on the shoes that different springs can fit into. It's a good idea just to document everything so that you have a reference in case you get mixed up. So we're just continuing with our spring removals here. And then at this point, it's easy enough to remove that rear shoe, but it is still attached by the parking brake cable. So we can just flip that out. And then these brakes are pretty small, and the spring on that parking brake cable is pretty weak. So it's easy enough just to slip the end of the cable out of its little holder. And then we can remove our little slack adjuster there, that last spring holding it in place. Now before we go and reinstall our new stuff, we want to clean everything really well. I'm just using some brake cleaner, degreaser there, cleaning all my parts, trying to get rid of as much of that brake dust as I can. Just makes my life a little bit easier, keeps my hands a little bit cleaner when I'm reassembling. And before we go ahead and put those shoes on, I do like to apply a little bit of dielectric grease. There's like 3 pads on that backing plate for each brake shoe. So I'll just come in and put a little bit of dielectric grease on each one of those little pads. And finally, I'm going to compress my wheel cylinder, make sure those pistons are free and that they're not bound up. Now, our slack adjuster here goes together because most likely it'll come apart as you're taking everything apart. There's a little L bracket on the slack adjuster there. You can see I've already spun our little slack adjuster nut up to make that assembly as short as possible, but we want to make sure that that little L bracket, the tab, is behind the stainless steel spring on the back of the adjuster, and that the little arrow on the front of the adjuster goes through a little slot. There's like a little window in that L bracket on the front. So we want to make sure that's through that as well, and that lets us know that everything's assembled properly. And then our last spring here goes underneath the adjuster when we get ready to put that back on the shoe. Now, reassembly, kind of the reverse of the disassembly, so we won't spend too much time on this, but in a second we'll just review and make sure that we've got everything installed properly. Now, just before we go ahead and clean our brake shoe material off one last time and go ahead and adjust the brakes, we're just going to check and make sure that all of our hardware is in the right spot. Starting with our spring on the bottom here, you can see, hopefully, it's right here. It's in these 2 holes. Moving up to our retainers, we're making sure that our the ridges on our little retaining posts there are in the divots in the cup. Up here, we're making sure this little spring is in that hole. This spring is in the top of those 2 holes. We're making sure that our self-adjuster, that little arrow's coming through the slot on this guy, and we're making sure that our wheel in the back here, our little wheel, adjuster wheel, is locked in with this thin plate here, this spring plate. And then over here, our top spring, top hole, bottom spring going under the adjuster here to the outside hole. It's not in this guy like on the other side. It's going to the outside hole. Again, making sure this spring is good and making sure our parking brake cable is locked into our plate in the back there. So now that we've got our rear brakes back together, we've got our shoes on, everything's looking good. What we want to make sure we do before we go any further is we want to adjust our spacing on our shoes. So there's the little adjuster here, it's a slack adjuster, I suppose. The little star wheel here, we want to adjust that so that the shoes are just barely starting to press on that drum a little bit, not actually put any force on it, but we want to have just a little bit of drag when the shoes are brand new. Because if we don't, what's going to happen is our brake pedal in the car is going to be super soft. So if we just put this together, we wound this guy in all the way so that we could get our drum back on, obviously. But if we leave this unadjusted, and it is supposed to adjust itself while you drive, but it never really works the way that it should. What we want to do is make sure that that's close to being perfect so that we'll have good brakes. And like I say, if we don't adjust it, you're gonna have a really mushy brake pedal. The pedal might go all the way to the floor, or you'll have very weak brakes, and we don't wanna end up with that. So we can see right now, you know, very loose going on and coming off, and we just wanna spin that guy out. I'll show you in just a second. So if we have a look down in here, we can see our little star wheel right there, and we've got the little detent on the back, spring loaded, and as we rotate that little star wheel out and extend the adjuster to push the brake shoes out a little bit on either side, you'll hear it click as it sort of ratchets over each one of those bumps. So if we just, I'm gonna do it here with the screwdriver, but you'll hear it as I turn it. Oops, that one was a bit too quick maybe. And you can see that detent. Now on either side of the car, the thread is going to be reversed. So we are always turning the top of that star wheel out away from the car, and that should ratchet. And if you try to go backwards, you'll know right away it won't want to go up against that little detent in the back here. So if I just ratchet it slowly, you should hear it. And you hear it just click in over the next step. And I'm going to adjust both sides out quite a bit, just because I had turned them all the way in when I was taking the shoes off and putting them back on. So right now I'm gonna ratchet them out quite a bit, and I'm gonna keep doing that and keep putting my drum back onto the brake shoes to make sure that they're fitting okay, until it gets to the point where it's difficult to put that brake drum back on. So if we have a look right now, just pull this out. If we have a look right now, you can see as I put my freshly, quickly painted drum back on here, still, you know, very loose on those shoes. So I'm gonna keep going with that adjustment. I'm gonna keep rotating that little star wheel out. Oops. And you can see I'm moving it quite a bit. And you can see that that little threaded part is moving out, so spreading the shoes as I go. And I'm gonna test my brake drum. Now, it is important to test fit it fairly often, because what'll happen is it'll be really loose, really loose, really loose, and then in the space of a few clicks, it's gonna get quite tight to put on. So you wanna make sure that you're doing it, checking it often, even if it is a little bit tedious, to make sure that you don't end up going too far and having to back it back in. If you do go too far, you can crank it backwards, but it's difficult because you have to hold that little spring detent up in order to rotate that star wheel backwards. It's gonna be a challenge. At that point, you might as well almost take it apart you know, spin it back in a little bit, put it back together, and then start again. Like I say, just do it, check it often, and you'll be good. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this on both sides of the car and then catch up with you guys in just a minute. So now that I've got both sides a lot closer, you can see just going on and off, you know, there is a bit of resistance. I'm getting closer. There's a bit of friction, but you can see it still turning. You can see that the hub isn't turning because the bolt holes are going past. So the drum's still spinning freely. We don't want to lock it up yet. But now that I'm pretty close on both sides, I'm actually going to get in the car and I'm going to pump the brakes up. I'm going to make sure that those brake cylinders are extended, because when we were in there and we were checking to make sure that they were free, push them in. I'm going to pump those all the way out. It's going to push the shoes all the way out. We're going to make sure nothing's binding and make sure that we can get our drums back off. And then we'll continue with that adjustment in just a second. And then I'll show you how the adjuster system is supposed to work while you're driving as well. Okay, so I'm going to try and show you guys how this is supposed to work when you're driving the car, and how it's supposed to adjust itself based on the wear on the brake shoes. So, just for visual purposes, I've got the drum off so that we can see that mechanism in there. But I'm gonna step on the brake pedal a little bit and hopefully show you guys how that system ratchets itself out under normal driving conditions, even when you have the brake drum on, but as your brake shoes wear, and you need to increase the distance between the shoes there. So I'm gonna go ahead and gently press on the brake pedal. And that, I think, clicked there. And that's basically how that works. Now, I don't want to do this with my adjustment too close to the final setting, because then I won't be able to get my drum on. I just wanted to show you guys how that works. And if we have a look here, hopefully I didn't go too far. Nope, I can still get my drum on. So now we're getting pretty close. I'm going to adjust them on both sides just a little bit more to get a little bit more resistance on that drum, only because they're brand new shoes, and so as they bed in a little bit, they'll get a little bit closer. I'm going to make sure that I have a good feel on the brake pedal when the car's running. That's important, that you start the car and apply the brake while it's running, because when you don't have the vacuum assist on the brake, it's gonna feel like you have a good pedal, and then you're gonna get out on the road and the pedal's gonna go to the floor. So I'm gonna start the car, make sure I have a good pedal. Once I've adjusted these a little bit closer to where I wanna end up, and once I've checked that all out, if everything's good, brake pedal's good, and my parking brake works, that's it for this job. We're all set. We've got our brand new brake shoes, brand new hardware, all set for the road again. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully this helped you out with your brake shoe replacement or diagnosing what's going on with your rear brakes, and we'll see you guys next time. Have a good one. Perfect.